Thank you for joining us this morning. It's been great to see the turnout to these sessions, and this one is focused on securely handling data in marginalized communities. It'll be discussing the issues encountered when handling the data of marginalized communities and how developers can think about and design for them. We're lucky today to have Gabriel Kirkpatrick with us. Gabriel is a security software engineer working in our Windows team here at Microsoft. And as a security-minded individual who came out in the digital age, he became acutely aware of how data identifying people as members of the LGBTQ plus community has been handled by online services, and how failures to protect that data has impacted the lives of people around the world. A lot for us to learn here. So with that, I turn it over to Gabriel. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. I didn't realize my whole bio was going to be read, so I have an intro slide that seems kind of redundant now. But my name is Gabriel Kirkpatrick. This is securely handling data in marginalized communities. So who am I? I'm a security software engineer. I work on Windows security, so mostly just trying to find vulnerabilities, fuzzing, Windows security research, which is basically nothing like what this talk is about. So completely different. I'm a reformed Xbox hacker. Xbox hacking was sort of how I learned about programming and security and what landed me here. So it's pretty weird to be standing on a stage at Microsoft, considering I was worried that I was going to get arrested most of my adolescence for that stuff. But you know, it's a nice relief. This is a picture of me catching a pig at the 2001 Blue Hill Fair pig scramble. This was published in the August 2001 issue of the Ellsworth American. So if any of you lived in Mid-Coast, Maine 17 years ago and read local newspapers a lot, you might recognize that from the article. A couple disclaimers. All the research in this talk was done prior to my joining Microsoft, so this has nothing to do with my work here at Microsoft. A lot of it's all public stuff. This talk is in no way affiliated with my work at Microsoft. As I've kind of mentioned several times by now, there's very little overlap between this and what I do here. This is mostly a case study of one particular app, actually a group of apps that I'm going to refer to as one app because there's like 30 of them and they all shared the same issues. And this app mostly focuses on discrimination and mishandling of data in apps and services focused at gay men. This is in no way meant to trivialize the discrimination and risks that are faced by other marginalized communities. This is just sort of the case study that I chose for this because it's the thing that I personally have the most data on. So just want to make clear that this is not saying these are the only things. This is supposed to just give you some context to think about the problems that face other groups. So let's look at some data weaponization over the years. 20th century was kind of a big time for it. The Nazis grabbed all of the population census data in the Netherlands and used that to track down Jews based on the data that they just stole from the government, which actually made Jews in Dutch Jews had a substantially higher death rate than any other country in Europe due to that access to data. Then over here, we used the US Census data during World War II as well to intern a bunch of Japanese Americans. So big time for the use of data to target specific groups. Then back in 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, the ID cards that specified ethnicity were used to track down and identify people. And then recently, this is clearly a pretty abridged list. There's plenty of other things that have happened, but recently I just saw Motel 6 is apparently now handing over lists of guests to ICE, which is a really weird case. But, you know, still data that's being shared to target specific groups. So as I mentioned, this is going to mostly focus on the risk to LGBTQ individuals. So LGBTQ individuals still face criminal persecution in many countries, and data that can identify people isn't always secured very well. So here's a fun map. This is from May 2017, so it's a little outdated now. India should no longer be that light red. It should now be kind of yellow, like China and Kazakhstan and the other ones around there, because they actually decriminalized homosexuality, which is awesome. But all the countries in the dark red, there's 8 of them, are countries that still have the death penalty for homosexuality. The not quite as dark red are countries which have 14 years to life prison sentences for homosexuality. And then the pinkish ones are countries that have up to 14 years for homosexuality. So these are sort of places where you don't want to be outed. Then the orange places are places with basically no promotion laws. So you might have heard back in 2014, the Russian gay propaganda law basically made it illegal to basically say that homosexuality was an acceptable lifestyle. So some Russian official described Russia as a big, comfortable closet for gay people to live in, where you can be gay there, but you just can't tell anybody. So back on this one, you can see all the countries with the dark green are countries that have same-sex marriage at a national level. So it makes the US and Canada look all great and all that stuff. But the US also still has some issues. So the light states here are states which have no protections in state law for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's 26 states, which is more than half of them, turns out, I think, if we still have 50 states. And then, yeah, only the darker ones are ones that have protections for both discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and then the other ones are kind of somewhere in between. So here's some numbers, some very inexact science that I ran based on the populations of the countries that still have the death penalty for homosexuality, internet penetration in those countries, so the number of people in each of those countries that have access to the internet, and then based on the 3.8% number of adults in the US who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, which this number came from. There are a number of varying numbers on this. This is the one that Wikipedia seemed the most confident in, so I trust it. In reality, I think it's probably a decent bit higher, but 3.8% seems like a safe number. So by taking the population and then the internet penetration and then at 3.8%, you can say, look, 3.8% of people with access to the internet in these countries are probably lesbian, gay, or bisexual, have some sort of homosexual attraction. So these are people with access to the internet who could be murdered for their sexual orientation. And they are put at risk by the mishandling of that data by services. So the number that I came up with was 6.8 million, which is a lot of people. And as I said, this is definitely not exact, but I think that's a decent approximate number to go with. So the risks to these people are outing. So outing is a term for exposing a member of the LGBTQ community who has not come out publicly. If you're handling personal data, you should probably be concerned about how that data could be used to out somebody, to identify them as a member of the LGBTQ community, especially minors. In the US, I believe 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. So there are a lot of kids who get disowned because they get outed to their parents. If you take that 40% and compare it to the 3.8% of the total population, it's kind of a lot higher. So you should definitely be concerned about outing everybody, especially minors, and especially people in countries that are incredibly hostile to LGBTQ people. In the US, this means employment discrimination, familial discrimination, and just hate crimes. People still don't like gay people a lot of places, it turns out. And then in other countries, it can mean death, which is no good. So there are a number of ways to out yourself and out other people. Number one is OSINT, which is the hacker way of saying looking at public info. So this is anything that people publicly put on the internet. So this is your Facebook likes, your tweets, just anything you put out there. A lot of people knowingly or unknowingly out themselves just by their Facebook likes, what groups they join, other stuff like that. And those are pretty obvious. Some of them are less obvious, where you kind of private your account, and there's still some data that leaks out on the side. So an example of that I noticed is Instagram likes. So if you make an Instagram account and you make it private, you think, oh, great, I'm private. Nobody can see what I'm doing on this Instagram account. I'm going to go like a bunch of gay stuff because nobody knows. So if you go and look at a photo posted by an account that's public and look at the likes, you can see which private accounts liked that stuff. So this is something that is not really well surfaced to people, and people who are not especially privacy aware would probably not notice this. But this is definitely something that I've seen by looking at content that is targeted to LGBTQ individuals, and then looking at the likes, being like, there's a lot of private accounts of like middle-aged men on here. That's kind of weird. Another one is public groups. This is something that we have on Xbox, which is actually awesome. There's this LGBT social club group on Xbox with like 22,000 members. That's like 220 full Fortnite groups of LGBTQ people. And this is a public group, so I'm presuming most of the people in here know that they're out. But it is still a way that it reveals some identifying information, somebody's gamer tag as being LGBT. There are also a bunch of other groups like this that are fully private that you wouldn't be able to see. Another example that I found that I thought was kind of weird was this Facebook group, which was the Uganda Gay Connections. So Uganda is one of the countries that still has the death penalty for homosexuality. And this is a public Facebook group with over 7,000 members, where people just go in with their real names and like post their phone numbers and addresses to try to connect with other gay people. Which, seems like a risky thing to do. If you're in a country like that, I don't know if all these people are aware of the privacy risks, but this is just another technique to out a huge number of people. You can also use science, data science, big data, machine learning, all that stuff, to analyze your OSINT, your open source intelligence. So back in, I think, 2014 or so, Microsoft Research Cambridge and the Cambridge Psychometrics Center published some research where they were able to identify personal details based just on Facebook likes. The models that they built proved 88% accurate for determining male sexuality. And Facebook likes are not a thing that you usually protect very much with your privacy. Those are usually just default open. So even if you private like you're interested in and other stuff that would identify you, people can still scrape this data and use this model to determine your sexuality, which is a little scary. And that data is available. Cambridge Analytica, I have Cambridge on the slide like 8 different times. I wanted to specify that Cambridge Analytica, as many of you probably remember, different thing from these other Cambridges. But they sold like a huge amount of that Facebook data. So that data is available for people to buy and then analyze it for good or bad. So now we're going to look at a case study, this thing sometimes works, of an app. Many of you have probably heard of Contoso. It's the Microsoft name for basically anytime we need a fake company, we'll just call it Contoso. Since I didn't want to specifically call out any individual apps, and these issues actually affect a lot of apps, I'm just going to pretend it's one app called Contoser. So Contoser is an app, or a bunch of apps, that came out in 2009. It was an early smartphone dating thing, and it featured location-based dating. So it would show you people really close to you. It would show you exactly how far away people are from you. And that kind of pioneered a bunch of ideas that the heterosexuals then stole from us for stuff like Tinder. But that's okay. But this location-based sort of style of building the app came with some issues. First issue is trilateration. Now, I'm not an expert in geometry or geography or geology or any of that stuff, but this one seems pretty simple. So the idea is if you know the distance from an unknown point to an unknown point from 3 known points, you can solve for the point. So if you want to find the location of somebody and you know the distance to them from 3 different points, you can figure out exactly where they are. So fortunately, Contoser provides users with location data very precisely. And if you just spoof your location to 3 different points and then pull data on that person, you can get their location from 3 different points. And then you can exactly find out where they are. And an illustration of this, I drew these lines and circles on this map of my old school. That says 0.24 meters. This is not to scale. It should probably be kilometers or something. But let's say you know that somebody is 0.24 kilometers away from you. So you get your map, and you draw a line, that distance, and then you use that as the radius for a circle. You know, OK, they are somewhere along the radius or along the circumference, along the border of that circle. So then you spoof your location to another place, and you find out, OK, now they're 0.2 kilometers away from me. So you draw another circle. And now you can see the circles are starting to overlap. So you go to a third point, and then you do this again, draw another line, then draw another circle, and then, boom, you know that whoever you're looking for is right there. So suddenly, just by drawing a couple lines and circles, you're able to geolocate anybody exactly where they are, which for an app mostly used by people who are still persecuted in a lot of the world is a little bit scary. So Contoser's solution to this was, you know, this is fine. This is kind of just a feature. It's not a bug. You should probably just go into your privacy settings and then hide your distance, which is an option that they provided. So you go into the settings on the app, and then you hide your distance. And what used to be this JSON response turns into this one. And now there's no more distance. So that's great. We're safe. Our people can't find us anymore. But there's a bit of an issue with this, where the list that comes down from the Contoser API is still ordered by distance. So even though in my distance in the middle is gone, you can still see the people before and after me. So you can tell, OK, this person must be somewhere in between these 2 people. So if we draw this with the lines and circles again, and we know the person after is 0.6666 kilometers away. The person before is 0.2333 kilometers away. Then you draw the circles, and you're like, OK, they're somewhere in here. But this is nowhere near as precise as the previous way, where you had exact circles. But it turns out that we can get a little bit more precise. So now that you have a range that somebody can be in, it's not exact, but it's a start. So we can use this hot new algorithm called binary search, which some of you guys might remember from CS1. It's a way of searching for something in a sorted list. And since the list that comes back from the API is essentially just a sorted list, we can use this in this scenario. So the way that it works is you start with a near bound and a far bound. So your near bound is the first person before your target on the list that comes back from the API, because they're the one that's closest to you. And then the far bound is the person immediately after them on the list that comes back from the API. So you take the average of those 2 distances, and then you place a second account, that distance away, the average of those 2 distances, from the account that you're using to get this distance data. And then you see if they appear before or after your target in the list. So if they appear before, that's your new near bound. If they appear after, then that's your new far bound. So you can repeat this a couple of times until the delta between your near bound and far bound is small enough that you can use it to draw a very tight circle. And then you repeat that from 3 different points. And then you can trilaterate again, because you now have these very precise distances that you can use to draw the nice circles and make the pointy line. So the way that this looks is you have a target, you have a near bound and a far bound. You take the average of those distances, and then you just place another account there. And see here, it appears after your target. So this becomes your new far bound. So you're now tight in the circle. And for a look at basically how long this takes, if you know that if you have a near bound of 0.233 kilometers and a far bound of 0.6666 kilometers, it's a lot of sixes. But if it was just 666, that would be bad, so I got to have the 4th one on there. So if we take the average of those and place another one on there, then you can see suddenly the circle gets a lot tighter. It's now 0.4449 or 0.4499 for our near bound. And so that's with 1 request. 2 requests, we get a new far bound, tighten the circle even more. 3 requests, it's starting to get pretty narrow. And then you do that just twice more, You have this nice circle where you're within 0.01 kilometers of each other. You could continue doing it from here, but this is basically all you need to get a pretty good location for somebody. So this issue was discovered by some researchers at Kyoto University in early 2016. I also discovered it around the same time, but I didn't publish any research because I didn't want to put people in danger, and the developers of this app were not interested in hearing from me. But these guys did, so good for them. They called it colluded trilateration rather than binary search, which is a better name. And to this day, none of these apps have done anything to actually mitigate this or address it. So this is still a thing that has been putting people at risk publicly for over 2 years. And I mean, these apps are going on 10 years old, they're 9 years old, that this has been something that people could trivially exploit to locate people very precisely. So that's all using the API and the functionality to identify people. There's still another big problem if you're in a country that has the death penalty for homosexuality, which is DNS. You probably live under passive surveillance of all your plain text traffic. It's a safe assumption. It's a safe assumption most places in the world. So with DNS, they don't even need to trilaterate you. The second you make that DNS query, they know, oh, this person's using Contoser, they're probably gay, let's go get them. So the response from Contoser after a big media storm back in 2014 when the first trilateration tools came out was like, oh, we're just going to geofence these specific areas. We're going to make it so that in areas that have stiff penalties for homosexuality, we just won't display people's locations at all. You can still use that previous method. It just takes more requests. But that doesn't really address the problem because they still had these plain text DNS lookups. They still had a bunch of plain text ads and stuff. So people who were in these regions were still put at risk by this passive surveillance, people immediately being able to tell people are using these apps. So that's not good. Some solutions to this are things that typically look like malware and crime, but are actually good privacy tools. One is domain fronting. This is used by like Tor, or not Tor. This is used by like Signal and Telegram when they were being blocked in Iran and Russia, I think last year during some protests. The Iran and Russia's solution was to just block AWS and Google, which is a pretty strong move. But presumably they wouldn't do that just to stop people from using these gay dating apps. Amazon and Google have taken some efforts to sort of cut down on this, but it's still possible, and it's good because it removes that DNS query that immediately incriminates you. Another one is Tor. So Tor is used a lot for crimes because it's really good at it. But it's also a great privacy tool in general. And, well, to us here, we only think about using it for crimes. For a lot of people living under repressive regimes and constant surveillance, this is an incredibly valuable privacy tool. So if you use GPS from your phone to just immediately identify, as soon as your app starts, that you are in a dangerous region, and then just do all of your network traffic over Tor, there are plenty of libraries for like iOS and Android to just wrap all of your network traffic in Tor. Then you remove all of that risk of passive surveillance. And there, as I mentioned, there's stigmas around these constantly being used for malware and crimes, but these are valuable privacy tools that protect a lot of people, and they're not going to go away, so we might as well embrace them to help people who actually need it. The next problem is ads and analytics, which is always fun. So most of the connections to the Contoser API, the screenshots from 2016, I think they've gotten better about this by now, but all of their Contoser API stuff was going over HTTPS, so that's great. But they still had a bunch of plain text ads and analytics that even if you had your location turned off, would send over HTTP the name of the app that you're using, your exact GPS location, and your name. And I think there was another one that also sent your email address. So even though all of your communication to Contoser themselves is encrypted, this is still fully decrypted. And once again, if you're anywhere with passive surveillance of plain text traffic, this will just immediately out you, and out you very specifically, because it has your GPS location in there. Then earlier this year, I forget exactly which researchers found this, after they got better and started putting everybody's stuff over HTTPS, I think they figured now would be a good time to just take more data because it's all safe now. And so they started sending people's HIV status in their to advertisers, which seems like a pretty personal piece of medical information that maybe not everybody wants their advertisers trying to sell them like TVs to have. But they decided that that was an important thing to get. I don't know what advertiser this is going to. I don't know how you get data from advertisers, but it seems like the advertisers have to sell that data to somebody, so somebody is going to get this information, and that seems dangerous to me. So generally, if you're writing an app where you record somebody's HIV status, maybe don't send it to third parties. That would be my suggestion. Law enforcement use of Contoser. There's not a lot documented about this because it turns out repressive regimes don't like talking about their techniques very much. I wish they would maybe come and give a talk at BlueHat about how they do stuff. That'd be great. But the one case that has been pretty widely documented was back in 2017, only a year ago. The Egyptian police used Contoser to basically sting a bunch of men in the country. They arrested, I believe, over 20 gay men in Egypt. That's the only case that we know of them actually using these specific apps for that. In Chechnya, where they had this big gay purge also last year, I guess last year was a big year for hating on the gays, the initial start of it was the arrest of somebody for completely different charges. I think it was a drug charge guy got arrested for. And then they just took his phone and went through his contacts. They're like, oh, you got gay people in here. Cool. And so I don't know for sure if they use Contoser. I have a feeling that, might have been on the phone, but I don't have any data about that. Nobody in Chechnya is returning my emails right now, so they won't tell me how they did it. Anyway, I'm sure that there's more than this. I've heard very anecdotal stuff, but I don't have any data behind it, but it's scary. Anyway, so takeaways. This is a pretty short talk. This is actually only a 30-minute talk, so you guys are going to get to go to lunch early, so you're welcome. Be conscious about the data that you're ingesting. Think about who your users are. Most of these apps that got made for Contoser kind of look like somebody just read a tutorial on like, how do I make an app and take all the data and put it in this database? And sometimes privacy needs a little more consideration than that. Maybe you don't need exact GPS location. So think about your users. Think about the data you're taking. Think about where they are. Think outside of like Redmond or San Francisco or wherever you're working from. Think like, hey, if somebody's using this in Iran, what could the implications of that be? Be proactive in your protections. A lot of people are not privacy aware, privacy conscious, and not everybody can be super educated on that stuff. So if you can tell, if you can recognize patterns that somebody is maybe exposing data that could be sensitive to them where they are, it could be used against them, maybe like prompt them like, hey, do you want to check out your privacy settings? Since apparently it was proven that you can predict male sexuality with 88% accuracy, it seems like that could be used to proactively protect people, before it gets used against them. So use that data to find people who might be at risk in specific areas and sort of prompt them like, hey, do you want to tighten your privacy settings? Stuff like that. So that's basically it. Be aware of the data that you're ingesting and think about how you can proactively protect people, because reacting to issues like this, like the stuff that happened with Contoser over and over and over again over the course of like 10 years is not great, and it costs people their lives sometimes. And that's really sad. So that's all I got. And now I will open it up to questions.
Hello, thank you for the talk. What is your interpretation of the increasing legislation of protecting consumer privacy on maybe cutting down some of these, capture and store all personal information possible? Do you have any insight like GDPR or how that may affect social media? Just kind of a general question.
I'm definitely not an expert in GDPR, but I think the more legislation there, the better. Like, The more that we can do to stop people from just hoarding every bit of personal data that they can get is probably for the good, because people don't seem very good at keeping it in one place and making sure that people don't get their hands on it. The thing, though, is a lot of these issues are stuff that might not be listed as personally identifying information. Stuff like a location data being sent in plain text, that's probably still, I don't know if that would be protected under GDPR, because that's in transit, it's not being stored. I think definitely privacy regulations are great and help push people toward doing things correctly, but I think that most developers still need to sort of take the initiative and figure out what they can do on their own to protect their users. But
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, anybody else? Over there.
Give me a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the talk. I wonder how many applications or apps did you actually test, or did you experiment with, and how many of these were actually confronted to this kind of problems?
That's a great question. I personally looked at about 4 or 5 back when I was doing most of this research I did 2 to 4 years ago. There is actually a website, I wish I knew the name of it right now, that actually tracks for all of the major apps. It has sort of like a table, and it describes do these use plain text analytics? Are these vulnerable to trilateration? So if you search gay dating app security problems, it's usually one of the first results. I wish I knew the name of it off the top of my head, but they've done a pretty extensive study of 20 to 30 of these apps. But great question, thank you.
Second question: what made you start looking into these apps and the API and the distance? What gave you that hint or that drive to dive into this issue?
I was kind of bored, and I just figured out how to man in the middle traffic on iOS, and I was like, I'll just do this to everything now. But I wasn't the person who figured out trilateration. I didn't know about that until 2014. There was a website that literally let you see on a map where people were on a bunch of these services. It's kind of a wake-up call to a lot of people. And after that, I sort of started looking into it, and that was when I figured out, oh, you can still binary search and figure this stuff out. But yeah, it was mostly seeing that first big privacy issue, which happened. That only happened 5 years after the apps had already been out. So people could have been using that for 5 years. Nobody really knew.
You were basically doing interception on the iOS traffic, and then you saw this app just sending the information. You just had a eureka moment.
Yeah. Well, so that was after I had already been aware of the trilateration issue. But yeah, that was where I noticed the analytics and a bunch of other stuff.
All right,
but I was just kind of going through every app on my phone, being anything cool here.
So you mentioned there's in the middle. You mentioned there is a website for looking at comparing and contrasting different apps. How aware are the people that are using these apps of the privacy implications of, I don't know, are they aware the website exists, and how much do they actually take into account what they're giving these applications?
I think most people probably are not aware. It would be great to go on these apps and survey people, be like, hey, did you know? I don't know if anybody has done that, but maybe be a great study to do. I think generally the people using these, it probably varies depending on a lot of factors, how privacy aware people are, but generally I think people are not very privacy aware on there.
Are there meta communities of people talking about it in any capacity, or is it mostly just security people?
There's not even really security people. It's usually once a year somebody figures something out, and then there's a big scare and a bunch of articles about it, and then everybody forgets a month later. But there's not a lot of continued pressure on these companies to do things better, and there's not a lot of ongoing public research, at least.
specifically in some of those countries that you mentioned that still carried the death penalty, and the internet penetration rates were surprisingly low. And I know there's some nonprofits who are working on just getting the communities exposed to what the internet offers. Do you know of any nonprofits who also focus on teaching the importance of privacy and security when they're trying to expose just the internet in general?
I wish I did. Unfortunately, I do not. I think the Tor project and the EFF probably do a lot of that, but that's a great question. I wish that I knew.
Great talk. Thanks for delivering it. In my experience, when you have a large group of applications that all kind of exhibit the same security behavior, they tend to be based on one or two different frameworks or core things that people readily grab off of the internet and slap on a couple of quick images, and then ta-da, I've got a mobile app. Do you know from your research or from your what you've been looking up, is there a particular framework that maybe we could look at to improve security from the ground up as opposed to focusing on one application at a time?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think definitely when it started, the apps really looked like a lot of people Googling like Objective-C tutorial, how do I get GPS location? And then PHP tutorial, how do I sort by GPS location? And that was about it. This is actually something that iOS and I believe Android already provide. When you request GPS location, it lets you specify the granularity of it. But everybody just always defaults to, yeah, give it the most precise location. And that's what's in every tutorial that you'll find. So nobody is actually taking advantage of these features that are built into the OS that help obscure that data. And that is also not surfaced by the operating systems. It doesn't say, like, hey, this app wants to get very precise location data, or hey, this app wants to get vague location data. So I think it would be good for the platforms to improve their messaging on that so that people know just how precise that data is. And I also think that, maybe if people didn't just copy and paste the code and looked at the different flags that maybe they could pass in to have better security there, that would be helpful. As far as the server side of it, though, I don't really know on that. Most of them seem to just be using like libraries for sorting in geographic order. So it's basically dependent on what they get back from the app, which is where I think they can probably improve the security.
Okay. So I know in the past that, when I get a new phone or something and I take a picture on the camera, it asks me if I want to store location data of where the picture was taken. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you see the same privacy risks about kind of that static data stored in metadata of like photos. Does it pose the same as triangulation on an app?
Oh, yeah. It definitely does, yeah. That is something that I actually have no idea about how they handle, because all of these apps let you upload a photo of some sort. So it probably varies per app how they process that data, but I imagine a lot of them probably preserve that metadata. So that's a great point. Yeah, I'd be very curious how they handle that. Thank you for your question.
Services that will allow you to look up by individuals with affiliations, $10,000 per seat per year.
Oh, it's a great deal.
You can repeat what I said.
Jessica just informed me that there are services that you can buy where you can look up individuals just based on data that they've just scraped off the internet?
Based on the data of like the location data in like Instagram posts and things like that, where we can actually triangulate bad people. Mm-hmm. I assume you can do it for other types of people.
Yeah.
Jessica, I actually reported an app that we
didn't mean to say this.
It's very interesting. No. But yeah, so I guess there are services out there that sort of aggregate that data from insecure sources like EXIF data just posted online. So that is probably a big issue. And apparently it's available for $10,000 a year. So governments can probably afford $10,000. Some of them. Sorry.
So I have a question. What can we do as users? What can we do to protect ourselves? Is the only way not using these apps, or, what can we do?
That's a great question. The only way not using the apps. Not entirely. It's probably the best way, probably the safest way. But I don't want to advocate jailbreaking your device because that comes with a whole slew of other problems. But spoofing your GPS location is a good way. Yeah, I think basically just factoring the risk, considering where you are. Like, I don't feel worried about using these apps here in the U.S., but I don't feel like I could advocate for anybody in a particularly hostile country using them under really any scenario. It just seems like a really bad idea. Yeah.
I just actually wanted to comment on your OSINT part, open source intelligence gathering. Mm-hmm. With the Kali Linux distribution, a very common live CD used for, well, pen testing, things like that. It comes with Maltego, and Maltego is written by IBM, and it actually has these things called transforms, where you can point it at any number of things and find, say, LinkedIn information, scrape through LinkedIn, then pivot that over to a query from Shodan, and inside about 1 hour with some very particular Google binging.
Thank you.
Yes, I remember where I work now. You can actually find quite a lot of information off of that. So this is just an addendum that it's not a bad idea to actually put yourself through these tools to get an idea of what your digital footprint out there looks like.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
My digital footprint has been so convoluted that my house is worth $1 million. I'm single, I have no family, and I'm white. So you can actually be very creative with these tools at times.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. All right. Is that it? Oh, one over here.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. One of the themes of some of the questions has been, what can we do as users to protect ourselves? Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, it doesn't seem reasonable to ask folks in places where internet penetration is really low and people are being exposed to the internet for the first time. It's not reasonable to ask, say, my grandmother to be privacy aware at this point. So have you thought about any models where we can help users protect themselves? Tor is scary to a lot of people. A lot of these other apps that are security aware are scary for people to use, but I'm imagining something that interdicts traffic on my iPhone that, like you talked about, if I'm in a specific place that might be dangerous, or if I feel that the U.S. is dangerous, I can interdict that traffic, and that sort of privacy-aware functionality is invisible from app to app. Because asking users to make hundreds of different decisions about the apps on their phone about what privacy features they should have, that seems like they won't have enough context to know what's good and what's bad. Yeah. Even it's difficult for us sitting here in the room at BlueHat to do it. So it's going to be really difficult for people who aren't, in this field. Yeah. Have you thought about what that model might look like?
A little bit. It definitely is an incredibly hard problem, and definitely people who are getting on the internet for the first time aren't going to instantly be like, I wonder if anybody's intercepting my plain text traffic and using it to make decisions about or infer things about me. So I think, as you mentioned, Tor is scary, it's in every possible way. But there actually are some really good just drop-in libraries available for iOS and Android, which will just pipe all of your traffic for your specific application over Tor, and that can be very transparent to the user. Not many things do it, but I think sort of building in that functionality is good. I think the idea of having something that intercepts all your traffic on your device, like just a VPN, would be great, but I think the issue there is just that it requires a certain level of technical savvy for people. So I think having the apps make these decisions, like seeing that you're in a hostile area and putting your traffic over something more secure, is probably the most attainable way. But it's a very tough problem. Cool. Anybody else? All right. Well, if not, thank you guys for coming, and thank you for all the great questions.